This is Chef Grissom with part 2 of our Crystalline Confections lecture, and we're continuing with our cordials. So in the last lecture we talked about how invertase changes fondant into a liquid. So the solid fondant, the invertase will invert that sugar and turn it into a liquid sugar syrup that's encased in chocolate. So 3 ways we can do that. We can dip them in chocolate, we can starch mold them, we can pan them, or we can shell mold them. So starch molding here, very much like we did with our gummy candy, our jellies candies, where we sift out our starch, create indentations in there, fill those indentations with the desired product that we're molding, allow it to set, dust off the starch, and then at that point we would cover that in chocolate. So very, very similar to our gummies. Alternately, we can make hollow shell techniques. So hollow shell is very much like we do with our bonbons. So we cook our syrup with the liqueur just like we would in our starch molding, and then we deposit that immediately into hollow truffle shells or molds, allow it to crystallize overnight, and then retemper chocolate and cap those molds. Okay, so in this case, the invertase would still be within that syrup. Okay, so allow that syrup to fully crystallize, and the invertase will work 7 to 10 days and turn it into a liquid. Some regional sugar, crystalline sugar confections, pralines, of course, we're going to be making these in class. Pralines are very common to the southern United States. They have very common regional ingredients. So we know that the southern United States is known for things like brown sugar, pecans, sugar cane, rum, things like that. We see that very, very commonly in especially the port cities of the southern United States. So Savannah and Louisiana, New Orleans, we see those. So of course that was a very common trade route, and these were items that certainly came from the Caribbean and do grow in the South. So specifically the pecans grow in the South, so you see that in a lot of the regional candies from here. So in order to make our pralines, this is again a crystalline sugar confection. We cook our syrup, allow it to cool. This is the most important part, is allowing that sugar syrup to cool and then creating agitation to create the sugar crystals in the form that we want them. If we agitate them too soon, you're going to form very large crystals. They're going to be very grainy. If you wait too long, it's going to crystallize too quickly, and the product will set too fast. Okay, maple candy, this is something that we see in New England, very similar. Typically these are starch molded into maple leaf molds, but instead of using cream, butter, and brown sugar like we would use for a praline, we use maple syrup. So maple syrup we know is not shelf stable in its natural form. We have to cook that to 240 degrees to make it 80% dissolved solids or more, and then we agitate it, same thing, allow it to cool to 120 degrees, agitate it, and then deposit it into those molds. But you see that quite a bit up in New England. So pralines, we want to cook our brown sugar mixture. This typically also involves butter and heavy cream. Cook it up until 240 degrees, so it's going to be that soft ball stage. And after we cool it to induce the crystallization, this one we can actually cool in the pot. It works even better. You don't want to make pralines in too large a batch because you're going to have to scoop them while they're setting. So after you cook your sugar syrup up, you shock your pan or your pot in an ice bath, set it off to the side, and allow it to cool undisturbed to 120 degrees. Then we put a wooden spoon in there and stir, 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 stir until it starts to look milky. As soon as it starts to look milky, we know that the crystallization process has started. We can start scooping that out. It should flow a little bit like lava when we put it on parchment paper, and then it should stop. If it holds the shape of the scoop, that means it's over crystallized. But the nice thing about pralines is we can put them right back on direct heat, melt down some of that crystallization, and we can continue scooping them out. Ideally, you catch it at the right time. and you work very quickly to scoop them out of the pot. If it takes a little bit longer to scoop them and they start to set up in the pot, you can put them right back on direct heat. Rock candy, unfortunately, we are not going to be able to make in class, but it's very, very simple to do. This is a great at-home project with your kids. It's really a lot of fun. So rock candy promotes crystallization kind of intrinsically. So we cook a sugar syrup to 240 degrees. We always want to have that kind of softball stage sugar syrup, very super saturated syrup. Pour it into a clean jar. At that point, we want to put either a string or a stick or a straw or something that we have coated in sugar syrup and rolled in crystalline sugar. So we're creating crystal nuclei at this point. We suspend that in the jar, and as time goes, the crystal nuclei that we have created in that jar will attract sugar crystals, and the crystals will grow on the outside of that. After about 2 weeks, you'll end up with rock candy. So it has to sit completely undisturbed. So this is why we don't make it in the classroom. We don't have 2 to 3 weeks of space where something will be completely undisturbed, but certainly that's something you could do in your homes. Now, an interesting thing people have been doing with this rock candy technique is they've been making these candy geodes, and some of you may have seen these. So what you do with a candy geode is you take some chocolate, tempered chocolate, and you basically make a large shell mold. Egg molds work great for this, but you want a 2-piece shell mold. So you would take your shell mold after it's set, you make it pretty thick, paint the inside of that chocolate mold with a little bit of cooled syrup, sprinkle some granulated sugar in there, tap out the excess, and let it dry. Put the mold together by heating up the chocolate, sealing the mold, but leave a hole at the top. At that point, when it's sealed together, you want to have your cooled syrup. Obviously, don't pour hot syrup into a chocolate mold, but take your cooled syrup and fill up that mold into the top, put a cap on it, and let it sit alone for 2 to 3 weeks. After 2 to 3 weeks, you can crack it open and you'll have rock candy growing on the inside of that chocolate mold. So we see this a lot in cake decorating, for example, where people will make these candy geodes and they'll put them inside the cake. So it doesn't have to be chocolate. You can certainly do this with rolled fondant. Really any kind of product would work for that that's not hygroscopic, and it makes kind of a neat project. Okay, maple candy we talked about a little bit earlier. So boil that maple syrup, crystallize it, pour it into molds. Another way that we can make a maple candy is basically to make a maple fudge. So fondant, using that maple syrup, place it into the mold, and we can seed that with a little bit of the same syrup, okay, that has the crystallization in there. So a couple ways to do that. We're going to be working with a few of these in class. We're going to be making fudge, pralines, pillow mints. Certainly once we have one down, it becomes very similar. You can see how a lot of these work. If you have any questions, by all means reach out and I will be here. I will see you in lab.